The wind howled as Jane stood at the cliff's edge, the letter trembling in her hand. This was the moment she'd been dreading, facing the truth she had long avoided. The past beckoned, but the choice was hers, to confront it or walk away. In the quiet moments that followed, Jane stared at the letter, knowing that its words would change everything. It was strange how a single piece of paper could hold so much weight. She had always believed in the stories, the ones where people were saved by answers, where everything made sense in the end. But this wasn't one of those stories. This was real life. The kind where answers didn't always come neatly tied up. She had been running for so long, afraid of what would happen when she finally stopped. The letter was an invitation to confront the past she had buried deep. But was she ready? Was anyone ever truly ready for the truth? The wind howled once more, pulling her back to the moment. The silence was deafening, and Jane realized that the only thing holding her back was herself. She had a choice: to face the truth or continue hiding behind the walls she had built. It was time to decide. Jane's fingers moved across the creased paper, her breath catching in her throat as the weight of the moment became unbearable. The letter had come after all these years, and now it seemed as if it had arrived to force her to confront everything she'd tried to leave behind. She had been so sure that running away would provide her peace, that the truth didn't matter. But now, the past was standing in front of her, demanding to be acknowledged. Each word in that letter was like a mirror, reflecting a part of herself she had locked away. Her mind raced as she tried to find a reason to delay, but she knew there was no escaping this. The letter was her only way forward, the one thing that could give her clarity, or perhaps tear everything apart. A sigh escaped her lips as she glanced back at the distant horizon, where the last light of the sun was fading away. The darkness ahead felt overwhelming, but she knew the answer was in the words she was too afraid to read. "I can't keep running," she whispered to herself. "I have to know." The thought echoed in her mind as she made the decision to finally open it. With shaking hands, she began to unfold the letter, bracing herself for whatever truths it might contain. With a trembling hand, Jane unfolded the letter, the crinkling sound loud in the stillness. Her eyes darted over the familiar handwriting, but the words felt foreign now. As the ink blurred in her vision, memories she had long tried to suppress came flooding back. Memories of a childhood she had spent years trying to forget. The words on the page no longer felt like answers, but accusations. The letter had come to expose what she had buried deep inside, the dark secret she had fought to keep hidden. But now, in her hands, it felt like a lifeline. There were no more excuses, no more running away. She could see the past standing in front of her, looking just as it had all those years ago. The letter was not just a message, it was a reckoning. Jane closed her eyes briefly, feeling a surge of emotion rising in her chest. Could she face what was in those words? Or would she let the fear continue to control her? A single tear slid down her cheek as she whispered, "I'm ready." It was time to finally know the truth, even if it shattered everything she thought she knew about herself. As Jane read the first few lines, her heart pounded in her chest, the words swimming in front of her eyes. The letter was from her father, a man she had thought long gone from her life. It wasn't just a letter, it was a confession, a plea for forgiveness, and a revelation all at once. The words danced before her, telling a story she never knew, a truth she never imagined. Her breath caught in her throat as the pieces of her life began to fall into place, each sentence unraveling a part of the mystery that had plagued her for so long. The letter spoke of secrets, of sacrifices, and of a decision made long ago, one that had shaped the course of her life. Jane's hands shook as she turned the page, the ink seeming to burn through her skin with each word. Was this her father's attempt to make things right, or was it too little, too late? Her eyes filled with tears as she read the final line, the last sentence that would change everything. She let out a soft gasp as the weight of it hit her. The truth she had been running from was finally here, and there was no turning back. She had to face it. She had to face him. Jane stood motionless, her gaze still locked on the letter as it burned a hole in her hand. The words were echoing in her mind, louder than any voice. Her father's secrets, his mistakes, they were all laid out for her to read. But what did she do with them now? The weight of it all crushed her chest. She had spent years imagining the answers, fantasizing about the day she'd find them, but nothing could have prepared her for the truth. It wasn't a neat little package of answers, but rather a messy, painful history. Her father had loved her, but his actions, his lies, had hurt her in ways words could never explain. She closed her eyes, trying to push back the flood of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. The wind began to pick up again, whistling through the trees as if urging her to move. But she couldn't. She stood frozen, caught between the past she had tried to bury, and the truth that now demanded her attention. Was this the moment she could forgive him? Could she forgive herself? The future seemed as uncertain as the horizon ahead of her. Jane had always thought that understanding the truth would set her free, but now she wasn't so sure. The truth felt like a trap, and she wasn't sure she was ready to escape. It felt like she was standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything. What was she supposed to do now? The letter had given her a glimpse of the truth, but not the full picture. Her father had made choices that haunted him, choices that shaped her life in ways she had never fully understood. She had always wondered why he left, why he never came back. But reading the letter, she realized the truth was far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. He had been trapped by his own demons just as she had been trapped by hers. Could she forgive him for abandoning her, for leaving her to carry the weight of his decisions? The letter was just words, nothing more than ink on paper, and yet it had the power to unravel everything she thought she knew about her past. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and for a brief moment she wished she could just walk away, forget everything. But that was no longer possible. The truth was here, and she had to face it, even if it meant confronting the most painful parts of herself. Her thoughts raced, tumbling over each other in an effort to make sense of it all. Was she really supposed to forgive him? Could she even begin to understand the pain he must have been in to make such choices? The letter didn't answer those questions. It only posed more. But Jane knew she couldn't hide from this. The truth was too heavy, too consuming. She couldn't just pretend she didn't care anymore. The past had a hold on her, whether she liked it or not. Her hand trembled as she reached up to wipe away the tear that had slipped down her cheek. Her father's words had cut through the protective walls she had built around herself for years. She had never wanted to face the reality of her family's brokenness, but now it was inescapable. She couldn't run anymore. For the first time, Jane wondered if she could ever truly move forward. Every step seemed uncertain, every choice a potential misstep. But she knew one thing. The decision to forgive was hers alone. And the longer she waited, the more the weight of the past would hold her down. Could she forgive him, or would she let this letter define her forever? Suddenly, Jane wasn't alone. The wind seemed to carry a presence with it, a feeling that she was being watched. She turned her head slightly, scanning the empty horizon. The forest below seemed peaceful, but the sense of urgency was palpable. Was this the moment to make a decision? Or should she give it more time to sink in? She couldn't help but think about all the times she had felt abandoned, all the times she had waited for someone to step in and make things right. But no one ever did. And now, as the weight of the letter settled in her hands, she realized that maybe she was the one who needed to make things right. She had spent too many years living in the shadows of her father's mistakes. It was time to step into the light, to take control of her own story. No more running, no more waiting. Jane knew what she had to do. It was time to find the answers, even if the journey ahead was painful. As Jane stared out over the darkening horizon, a strange calm settled over her. The past wasn't something she could change, but it also didn't have to control her anymore. She realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the past. It was about freeing herself from its grip. The wind picked up once again, but this time it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a guide, pushing her towards something she couldn't yet understand. The letter was only the beginning, not the end. There was a long road ahead, but she was ready to take the first step. She tucked the letter into her pocket, the weight of it comforting now, like a reminder of the journey she had ahead. Jane knew that the road would be hard, but it was hers to walk. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The morning after the storm, Jane sat on a weathered stone bench by the lake, her fingers tracing the edges of the letter as she reread it for the umpteenth time. The words were no longer strangers, but they still stung as if they had been written just yesterday. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with shadows of her past. And now, as the sun broke through the mist, she wondered if the answers she had long sought would ever come. Was this really the closure she had been searching for, or was it just another layer of pain she had to endure? The truth had always felt elusive, like a distant shore that seemed to slip further away the closer she got. Jane closed her eyes and breathed deeply, the crisp morning air filling her lungs. Her heart ached with the weight of what she had learned, and yet there was something else stirring within her. A small spark of realization that the answers she sought might not be as important as the journey she had to take to find them. She had always believed that knowing the truth would heal her, but now she understood that sometimes it was the struggle itself that brought growth. And for the first time in a long time, Jane felt ready to face the unknown. As Jane sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The air around her felt thick, almost oppressive, as though the weight of her emotions had drawn the very earth to her side. She glanced around the lake, but there was no one in sight. Still, the sense of being observed lingered, gnawing at the edge of her thoughts. She had always been a private person, hiding her vulnerabilities from others, but now, as the fog slowly lifted and the world around her grew clearer, she realized how much she had been hiding from herself. The letter had forced her to confront a past she had never truly dealt with, and yet, instead of feeling liberated, she felt even more trapped. The truth had come with a price. She wanted to ignore it, to bury it again, but she knew that was no longer an option. Her father's words were like a key to a door she wasn't sure she was ready to open. But the door was already creaking, begging to be unlocked. It was the only way to move forward, and Jane knew that in order to heal, she had to face the darkness head-on. The question was, could she do it without losing herself in the process? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Jane didn't need to turn around to know who it was. His presence had always felt like a shadow following her, a reminder of things unsaid. The mentor, the one who had guided her to this moment, now stood quietly beside her. Without speaking, he sat down on the bench next to her, his presence both comforting and unsettling. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the shore, and the distant call of a bird. Finally, Jane broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do I move on from this? How do I live with this truth?" The mentor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small worn book. He opened it slowly, as if the words inside held a deeper meaning than what was written on the page. "The truth is not a burden to carry," he said softly, his voice steady. "It is a gift. It shows you who you are, who you've always been." Jane looked at him, the confusion still etched across her face. "But it hurts," she whispered. "And it feels like it's destroying everything." The mentor smiled gently, his eyes twinkling with an unspoken understanding. "That's because you're not yet ready to embrace it, but you will be." The words of the mentor echoed in Jane's mind long after he had left her at the lake. As she walked through the woods, the weight of his message settled deeper into her soul. The truth wasn't a burden. It was a mirror that reflected everything she had tried to hide. She had spent so much of her life believing that she was defined by the things that had happened to her, by the mistakes of others, by the pain she had endured. But perhaps, she thought, she was more than that. The trees around her were tall and imposing, their roots stretching deep into the earth. Just like them, she had grown from the struggles she had faced. The path ahead of her was unclear, but it didn't matter. She had learned that the road to healing wasn't a straight line. It wound, it twisted, and at times it felt impossible to navigate. But that was okay. She could walk it, one step at a time. The letter was still in her pocket, but she no longer saw it as a source of pain. It was a part of her story, just as the forest was part of the landscape she now embraced. The truth, like the trees, was a part of her growth. And now, she was ready to move forward. As the days passed, Jane found herself at a crossroads. The weight of the letter still lingered, but the tension that had once felt unbearable began to ease. She met with old friends, walked through the familiar streets of her hometown, and for the first time in ages, she felt like she was reconnecting with the world around her. The truth, though painful, had given her a new perspective. It had broken her down, but in doing so, it had made room for something else to grow. Understanding, acceptance, and the possibility of change. Jane knew she wasn't finished yet. There were still moments of doubt, still fragments of the past that clung to her, but she was no longer afraid of them. She had learned to face them, to acknowledge them without letting them control her. As she sat on a park bench watching the children play nearby, Jane smiled to herself. She had come a long way, and though the journey wasn't over, she had taken the first steps toward healing. The past would always be a part of her, but now it was just a chapter, not the whole story. And the future? It was hers to write. It was a quiet evening when the unexpected arrived. The truth Jane had feared for so long, now standing before her in the form of an old man she hardly recognized. Her father's brother? She hadn't seen him in years, not since the family fractured. His voice was the same, though a little weaker, worn by time. "Your father, he's not who you think he is," he said, eyes filled with regret. Jane felt the ground beneath her shift, as if she were being pulled into a reality she wasn't prepared for. Her body stiffened, the warmth of the late afternoon sun feeling too harsh against her skin. Her mind raced. What more could she possibly learn about a man she had already buried so deep within her memories? Yet there he was, standing in front of her, holding answers she had never thought she wanted. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, filled with the weight of years left unsaid. He continued, "The man you knew, he never meant for you to find out. He was protecting you, in his own way." Jane could barely breathe. Her father had protected her, but at what cost? The truth was unraveling faster than she could process, leaving her with more questions than answers. And yet, part of her knew, this was the moment that would change everything. There was no going back now. Jane stepped back, her breath quickening as the revelation settled into her bones. "What are you saying?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper, disbelief coloring each word. She had spent her whole life believing in the version of her father she had created in her mind, a man who had abandoned her but had also left a space of mystery, one she had carefully avoided. But now, her uncle was tearing that illusion apart. He looked at her with deep, sorrowful eyes, and for the first time she could see the depth of regret in them. "Your father," he began slowly, "he didn't just leave for a job. He was trying to protect you. There are things you don't know. Things you can't know yet." The air between them thickened with the unsaid words, and Jane's heart began to pound in her chest. Could she trust him? After all this time? How could he expect her to believe this new version of the man she had spent years grieving? Her mind screamed at her to walk away, to shut down, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. She had come this far. Could she afford to close the door on the truth now? Her world was tilting on its axis, and she had no idea how to regain her footing. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind as Jane paced the small living room, her thoughts racing. Every step felt like a crack in her foundation. How could her father, the man who had left her, have been protecting her? She had always felt abandoned, yet she realized for the first time that she had never truly understood the reasons behind his actions. Her heart wavered between anger and sorrow. "How can you expect me to believe you?" she demanded, her voice rising. The uncle's tired face remained unchanged, his expression calm, though his eyes betrayed a pain much deeper than she had anticipated. "You'll understand, Jane," he said softly, almost pleading, "but not yet. There's so much you don't know." She stopped in her tracks, staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. Was there any truth in his words? Or was he simply another person trying to manipulate her emotions, using her father's memory as a weapon? The uncertainty in her heart grew as the silence stretched between them. The last remnants of her father's mystery were slipping through her fingers, leaving behind nothing but shadows. Jane felt herself caught between the past she thought she knew, and the truth that was slowly coming to light. The night stretched on, and the storm outside mirrored the one raging inside Jane. Her uncle had stayed for hours, but each minute had only deepened the pit in her stomach. She stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at the rain beating against the glass. The cold, relentless downpour seemed to echo the coldness she felt in her heart. Was this all she had left of her father? Fragments of lies and half-truth? Her uncle had said there was more to know, but every part of her wanted to shut him out, to bury the pain he was unearthing. She had lived in the absence of truth for so long, maybe it was better that way. But as she looked out at the storm, something shifted. Perhaps the storm wasn't something to be feared, it was something she needed to face. She had spent so long running from the past, from the anger and the hurt, but now it was clear that if she was going to heal, she had to confront it head-on. The storm outside was fierce, but Jane felt the stirrings of strength rising within her. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, something she could take control of, rather than letting the past control her. The morning came with a silence that felt different from all the others. Jane had not slept, yet she woke with a sense of clarity that startled her. The storm had passed, leaving only puddles on the ground, and the fresh scent of rain in the air. She stepped outside, feeling the crisp air brush against her face, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. There was a sense of freedom in the quiet after the chaos. Jane walked to the edge of the property, where the view of the rolling hills stretched out before her. She had no answers, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. Whatever her uncle had shared with her, it had opened something within her, something she could no longer ignore. She didn't need to understand everything right now. She had to move forward, and with each step, she felt the weight of the past lessen, even if only slightly. The future was uncertain, but that was no longer a reason to stay frozen. Jane turned back to the house, ready to face whatever came next. Jane stood at the crossroads, the path before her uncertain. But her resolve was stronger than ever. The weight of the letter, the revelations about her father, and the truth her uncle had revealed, they no longer held her in chains. With each passing day, she felt lighter, as if the burden of years had finally started to lift. But now came the hardest part, facing the man who had abandoned her, the one she had spent years resenting. Her father. She had heard his voice in the distance, in the stories she'd been told, but now she was ready to confront him. She couldn't keep running from the pain, nor could she keep ignoring the possibility of reconciliation. As the wind picked up, rustling the autumn leaves around her, Jane realized that this was the beginning of something new. She had learned to embrace the unknown, to accept the messy, complicated truth of her life. It was time to move forward. But would she be able to forgive him? That was the question, and Jane knew it was one she needed to answer for herself. Jane walked through the small village, her eyes scanning the familiar faces, though none of them felt like home. She had spent years avoiding this place, pushing aside the memories of what once was. But today, the streets felt different. As she neared the house where her father had lived, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The house stood unchanged, a relic of her past, and yet it now seemed like a stranger's home. She had never thought she would return here, especially not after everything that had happened. But as her footsteps carried her closer, Jane realized that the truth she had been avoiding was tied to this place. It was here that the last piece of her father's story awaited her. The question that had haunted her for so long, "Why did you leave?" would finally be answered. Her heart beat louder with every step. She was ready, or at least she told herself she was. She didn't know if she could forgive him, but she knew she had to find out what happened before she could ever move on. The door creaked open slowly, the sound echoing in the quiet air. Jane stood frozen for a moment, her heart racing. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to expect. A voice from inside called her name, a familiar yet distant sound that pulled her into the room. Her father was sitting by the window, older than she remembered, his face lined with years of regret and pain. "Jane," he whispered, as if the word itself held all the apologies he had never been able to say. She felt a lump in her throat, her emotions threatening to spill over. For years she had carried the weight of his absence, and now, as she faced him, she realized that the pain she had felt wasn't just from him leaving, it was from not understanding why. And here he was, the man she had built up in her mind, sitting in front of her, no longer a mystery, but a man broken by his own choices. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. Jane took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Why did you leave?" she asked, the words coming out in a rush, like a dam breaking. Her father didn't answer right away, his gaze dropping to the floor, as if the weight of her question was too much to bear. "I was trying to protect you," he said finally, his voice low and ragged. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought if I left, it would keep you safe from the things I was running from." Jane's eyes filled with tears, the flood of emotions threatening to break through. She had never known how much she needed to hear those words, until now. But they were still not enough. The pain of the years lost, the confusion of growing up without him, it all rushed back, mingled with the sudden realization that he had been trying to protect her in his own broken way. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Could she forgive him? Could she ever truly understand the choice he had made? As the days passed, Jane's emotions settled into a quiet understanding. The pain of the past would never fully disappear. But it had shifted. She had heard the truth she so desperately needed, and with it came the opportunity to heal. She sat in the park, watching the children play, their laughter filling the air with innocence and joy. It was a moment of peace she hadn't known in years. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. She had learned to accept the complexity of her father's actions, and, in doing so, had found a sense of forgiveness. Her heart no longer felt burdened by the weight of unanswered questions. Jane looked up at the sky, the clouds parting to reveal the sun, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel hopeful. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was hers to walk, one step at a time. And with each step, she knew she was becoming the person she was always meant to be. Days passed, and Jane felt a quiet change within herself. The heavy weight of the past had shifted, and though the scars remained, they no longer controlled her. She stood at the window, looking out over the city below, a soft smile forming on her lips. It had been weeks since she had reconciled with her father, and for the first time she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from having all the answers. It was the peace that came from accepting the uncertainty. She could never change what happened, but she could change how it defined her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she understood that healing was not a destination but a journey, one that didn't have a clear end. It would come in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, but always moving forward. Jane's life was no longer anchored by the weight of unresolved questions. She had embraced the uncertainty and found freedom in it. The truth had set her free, but it was her choice to step into the light that had truly healed her. The next morning, Jane walked through the park, her mind clear and her heart lighter. She noticed the small things now, the dew on the grass, the sound of birds singing, the way the trees swayed in the wind. Life had become less about rushing towards some future goal, and more about appreciating the present moment. She passed by an elderly woman feeding birds on a bench and smiled at her, exchanging a brief but meaningful look. It was a simple connection, yet it spoke volumes about the beauty of human interaction. Jane realized that healing wasn't just about reconciling with her past, it was about reconnecting with the world around her. She had been so focused on her pain, on what was missing, that she had forgotten how to just be. Now, with each step, she felt more grounded, more connected to the life she had always taken for granted. The journey wasn't over, but she was no longer trying to escape it. She was learning to walk with it. As the days turned into weeks, Jane began to focus on her own growth. She had always been the person who tried to fix others, to help them heal. But now she realized that healing had to start with herself. It was easy to get lost in the idea that someone else's actions defined your story, but Jane knew now that her life was hers to shape. She started journaling again, pouring out her thoughts, her fears, her hopes. The pen became an outlet, a way for her to untangle the mess of emotions she had held inside for so long. One evening, as she wrote, she reflected on the strength it had taken to reach this point. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Every tear, every moment of doubt had led her to this understanding. That healing wasn't linear, and it didn't come with a set timeline. It came in waves, and that was okay. For the first time, she embraced the unknown with open arms, ready to see where the next chapter would lead. One evening, Jane received a letter from her father. It was brief, just a few lines, but it was enough. The letter was an apology, an acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, and an invitation to reconnect. Jane held the letter in her hands, the weight of it heavier than she expected. It was the final piece of the puzzle she had been trying to solve. She didn't know what to expect from this new chapter, but she realized that she was no longer the same person who had walked away from him years ago. The fear that had once paralyzed her now felt distant, as though she had already crossed that bridge. She was no longer afraid of what the future might hold, because she had already faced the hardest part. The truth, the pain, and the healing had all come together to create something stronger than before. Jane was ready for the next step, whether it led to her father's door or somewhere else entirely. The letter, though short, was enough. Jane placed it carefully in her drawer, feeling a sense of closure that had eluded her for so long. She had come full circle, from a place of anger and confusion to a place of acceptance. Her father's words didn't change the past, but they offered her something she had never received: the truth. She sat in silence, reflecting on how far she had come. The journey had been long, but every step had been necessary. Now Jane understood that forgiveness wasn't about absolution. It was about setting yourself free. She felt a gentle peace settle over her. It wasn't a sudden change, but a quiet realization that she had finally learned to live with her past, to coexist with the pieces of her life that had once felt irreparable. As she stood up and walked to the window, the city below felt different, as if it were hers to shape. The future wasn't clear, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face it. The morning sun bathed Jane in its golden light as she stood by the window, reflecting on her journey. She had made peace with the past, but this was only the beginning. She felt ready for whatever the future held, a new chapter waiting to be written. As Jane walked through the city streets, she felt a quiet sense of belonging. The world no longer felt foreign. She had learned that life was about embracing the journey, not perfection. For the first time, she was simply present in the moment. In a quiet cafe, Jane reflected on everything she had learned. Her mind was at peace. Life was fluid, and healing was a process, not a destination. She stood up, ready for whatever came next, knowing that each new day was part of her journey. Standing before her old home, Jane realized she no longer needed closure. The truth had always been within her, and now she was ready to create a new chapter. Past was part of her story, but it no longer defined her. With the door closing behind her, Jane stepped into the future, free from the weight of her past. The journey wasn't about a perfect future, but about embracing what lay ahead. The world was full of possibilities, and she was ready to embrace them.